Welcome to Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we'll walk you through the Epicurean texts and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We're now in the middle of a series of podcasts intended to provide a general overview of Epicurean philosophy based on the organizational structure employed by Norman DeWitt in his book, Epicurus and His Philosophy. Now let's join the discussion. Welcome to episode 178 of Lucretius Today. We're continuing in chapter 13 starting this week, the True Piety, a discussion of Epicurus' views of the true nature of the gods, which is a very controversial subject. There's a lot of different opinions as to what Epicurus really thought, what he was trying to say, whether he was sincere or not in the way he was saying it, and lots of questions also as to the practical implications of a view of the gods to us today, especially as people who are interested in Epicurean philosophy and wanting to apply it in our own lives. We have to ask the question, is this part of Epicurean philosophy still relevant today and something we should take an interest in? We have not really discussed a lot of detail about it in the course of this podcast. When we've come to sections in Lucretius in the past where we've discussed the gods, we've had discussions about this. But other than the material in Lucretius we've discussed, we've never really taken up the other major sources of information about Epicurean theology, one of which is Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, in which he has a character by the name of Velleius represent the Epicurean position. That's one of the major sources that's out there that DeWitt will be pointing us to as we discuss this chapter. And of course, there's material in Philodemus's Own Piety, another fragment that we've really not gone into. What we should talk about before we get started is it something that's still relevant? Does it provide benefits? And is it something we should be interested in at all?
I'll jump in on that one. And I think that one of the things we have to remember is that even though we're talking about Epicurus living, 2,300 years ago and the Epicureans being in the early part of the 100s and, up to that early Common Era time period, Epicurus obviously placed a huge amount of importance on a correct understanding of the gods. I think that was one of the things that he really hit. I mean, it's the first principle doctrine. It's in the letter to Menoikeus. I think that having that right understanding of the gods is of paramount importance to him. And so by extension, I would think that if you're interested in Epicurean philosophy, it's one of those things that you have to wrestle with. The fact that he brought it up so often and at the head of all the lists that he made for a right understanding, that if you continue to think of the gods as having that direct influence on your life and that they can bestow punishment on you and you have to propitiate them for all the benefits in your life, that's one of the major sources of anxiety it seems that Epicurus had. So with that, I mean, we can analogize and we can make it a metaphor and we can do all things like that. But I think that basic premise was of paramount importance to him.
Joshua?
I should first say that as far as I can tell, they are absolutely unique in any ideology or religion or thought or philosophy. He removes the gods to such a point, both from the creation aspect and from the intercession aspect, as to render them unnecessary, which is exactly what Simon de Laplace, when he wrote his magisterial book on physics and presented it to the Emperor Napoleon of France. And Napoleon said, "Why have you not included God in your understanding of physics?" And Laplace responded, "I had no need of that hypothesis."
That's a great line.
Yeah. That's kind of where I've come down on the Epicurean gods. But yeah, I'm not even sure that's a good place to start.
You're absolutely right, Joshua. It's almost hard to figure out where to start because it's such a huge part. We have the entire sections of Cicero's book about the gods, and we have Epicurus's place of primacy for an understanding of the gods. But I don't know whether it's generated a lot of light, but it's certainly generated a lot of heat over the centuries.
This discussion already has reminded me that this is where probably I would like to start, is back with the point of who we're talking to and who's listening to the discussion and who's actually reading Epicurus here. I think we have a tendency in Epicurean discussion on the internet, we're all talking to a similar group of people who are not primarily religious, at least at this point in their lives. And there's a lot of people in that category who don't consider this to be relevant at all, any more than it would be relevant to discuss, I don't know, the other side of the moon or the design of merry-go-rounds in Germany in 1853 or something like that, something that's just not relevant to anything because they've dismissed this topic from their minds. But that's where the foundation starts. Epicurus was talking to ordinary people who had ordinary concerns and ordinary understandings that they had been taught about the nature of the gods. And so the deprogramming of these harmful ideas that was so prevalent in Epicurus' time seems to have certainly been important to him. And in fact, they are important today, too, depending on who's listening to the conversation, because most of the world still is highly concerned about whether there is providence and divine intervention. And not only that, of course, but the secondary issue that's also of such importance to Epicurus is whether there's a heaven and a hell and whether you're rewarded or punished after death and so forth, which is very tightly related into the issue of religion in general. So the foundation of everything we're talking about is how important it is. And Epicurus wanted to address those people who have these concerns. I mean, he's acting as a doctor to some extent, not only going after the truth of the situation, but wanting to make sure that the words he was saying were useful. And sort of quoting Diogenes of Oinoander, if the majority of the people around you are like sheep catching diseases one from another in a sort of mental sickness that they've gotten from these misunderstandings about the way the universe works, then you don't treat the patient you'd like to have, you treat the patient you do have. And the patient you do have in the world then and the world today, one of their significant problems is they have these ideas about whether there are gods and what those gods would be like that Epicurus is saying were just totally wrong. But we know some people who have reached such a level of confidence maybe in their position as to the irrelevance of religion that they are just not interested in the topic. And for those people who are not interested in it, then maybe this is not the episode they'll want to spend a lot of time listening to. But most of us have been brought up to believe certain things about the existence of gods and the nature of those gods.
Exactly. Yeah, you're talking about the average person out there. I just heard a statistic the other day that 70% of Americans still believe in some respect that Jesus will return. So there's still a large number of people out there that have a specific view of the gods and small g and capital G and what their influence is on the world.
Your question was, is this relevant for now? Is it applicable for people now? And one of the most difficult things I wrestle with is back in Epicurus' time, there was polytheism. So there were multiple gods, but now we have monotheism. And somehow it doesn't quite transfer. It's like you have to remember that it was a different kind of atmosphere regarding religion. And maybe it's because of my own Christian upbringing that whenever there's this plural gods, it doesn't seem to have the same power or the same place as the word God, singular. So I think it's one issue where it takes some translation from the past to the present, which is now monotheism. And also, as far as how this is actually useful now, we do have to accept there are people that continue to believe in God. I mean, this is for atheists. For people who don't believe in God, they still have to realize there are many other people that believe in God. And so that is one aspect I think is useful in the Epicurean philosophy regarding the gods, because it provides a way to keep your mind open and remember, yes, even though as atheists saying God is dead, well, actually, for many people, God is not dead.
Okay, taking what Colosini said as a point of departure, what I would say in response to that in an attempt to summarize the whole issue is she's absolutely right. And Don mentioned earlier that 70% expect Jesus to return at some point in their lifetime or not. And presumably these people today find this as a source of hope and comfort. The danger in the ancient world is that people didn't see the gods that way necessarily. In the ancient world, in this world of Greek paganism, if you want to call it that, the gods were not quite a blessing for mankind, nor were they exactly indifferent. I guess their behavior could best be described as erratic at best. So you have more in the ancient world, I think, to fear from the gods than you have to hope, because in ancient Greece, the afterlife is no great blessing either. As I think Lucretius, quoting Ennius, says, you wander around as a shade, pale in wondrous wise. So the issue is, and Epicurus is putting his finger on this one point here, which is that religion, particularly in the ancient world, is associated with fear. That's the root underlying problem. And that the religion of the ancient world didn't do much to assuage that fear. Now, you could say that Christianity has tried to take a different course, but I think that even the Epicureans, if they were alive today, would say the same problems are inherent in Christianity. And I was talking before we recorded about this horrible sermon in colonial New England by Jonathan Edwards called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And in that sermon, he says to the congregation, he says, you are 1,000 times more abhorrent, more vile to God than the lowliest serpent is to you. And you're hanging by a thread over a chasm, and that chasm is the lake of fire. And it is only by God's grace that you're still alive. It's only by God's grace that he hasn't dropped you, but he hates you while he's holding you. It was quite dark, and it's not the kind of Christianity you're likely to see today. But in the ancient world, it wasn't like you were despised by the gods. It was more like you were sport for the gods, in a sense. They were capricious. They were jealous. They had their own interests, and they were trying to pursue them. And whether that hurt you or helped you or not was irrelevant to them. It's not like in the Old Testament where the tribe of the Hebrews is consistently letting God down, and he has to exile them and punish them, but he'll give them what he promised them one day. It's that, there is no promise, there is no covenant, and there is no reciprocity there. You're like an insect on the trampling grounds of their world. And so two things are problematic. One of them is, in the ancient world, the belief that the gods will intercede in your life while you're alive and cause you pain, probably, or perhaps some kind of blessing, maybe. But the real problem is what people feared after they died. That's where the real issue for the Epicureans comes in, is this fear of death, which is based on uncertainty. And I'm not going to quote Hamlet extensively, but he's got that famous soliloquy about the dread of what's to come after death. And if it weren't for that, we would kill ourselves because the earth is so terrible to begin with. But the only thing that stops us is this horrifying uncertainty of what's going to happen after we die. And that, to me, is the point of departure for where we take off. So the question that DeWitt goes into now is, do the gods even exist? We hear all these claims. We're living in a world surrounded by people making assertions about the gods. Where do we even start? The place to start is here on page 250 at the bottom. Knowledge of the gods. How do we know they exist or not?
Right, Joshua. I think you've done a very good job summarizing that. And DeWitt is going to take us now, as you've said, first into this question of how we know about them. As a bridge into that, let me validate what you just said, Joshua. Again, a lot of the material that we're going to be dealing with is coming from Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, a narrative given under the name of Velleius. And let me take a second and read something that takes us into this discussion of how we know about it. This is Velleius talking. He has gone through and criticized opinions about the gods that the Stoics and other people, other schools had been teaching. And then he says this, quote, I have given a rough account of what are more like dreams of madmen than the considered opinions of philosophers. For they are a little less absurd than the outpourings of the poets, harmful as these have been, owing to the mere charm of their style. The poets have represented the gods as inflamed by anger and maddened by lust, and have displayed to our gaze their wars and battles, their fights and wounds, their hatreds, enmities, and quarrels, their births and deaths, their complaints and lamentations, the utter and unbridled license of their passions, their adulteries and imprisonments, their unions with human beings, and the birth of mortal progeny from an immortal parent. With the errors of the poets may be classed the monstrous doctrines of the Magi and the insane mythology of Egypt, and also the popular beliefs which are a mere mass of inconsistencies sprung from ignorance. Anyone pondering on the baseless and irrational character of these doctrines ought to regard Epicurus with reverence and to rank him as one of the very gods about whom we are inquiring. For he alone perceived first that the gods exist, because nature herself has imprinted a conception of them on the minds of all mankind. For what nation or what tribe of men is there but possesses, untaught, some preconception of the gods? Such notions Epicurus designates by the word prolepsis, that is, a sort of preconceived mental picture of a thing without which nothing can be understood or investigated or discussed. The force and value of this argument we learn in that work of genius, Epicurus's rule or standard of judgment. So let's discuss how Epicurus had dismissed all of these ridiculous notions about what the gods are doing and replaced it with a perception of the gods that comes at least in part through prolepsis. I suppose Don would be great at explaining this to us, right, Don? Would you like to start with how prolepsis is our foundation of knowledge about the gods?
Oh boy, that's a hard one, especially because it's not even really agreed upon what that word prolepsis even means. I would direct people also to our conversation that we had with Dr. Glidden. He discussed some of the things about the prolepsis as well, about pattern recognition and things like that. So it really is, I try personally, for what it's worth, I try and wrap my brain around this is to the innate sense of awe and that sort of emotion that we have that has been shown to exist even in babies and toddlers, that they can be, their attention can be held by something novel and something, sort of bigger than themselves. That's the only way I've been able to sort of at this point to sort of understand the prolepsis of the gods, is because according to Epicurus, we have some sort of innate sense that there are gods, and he has, tried to put as most commentary on that as he can. But there doesn't seem to me to be a way that you can really rationalize the idea that we have an innate conception, for lack of a better way of putting it, of beings that exist that are eternal and immortal and, indestructible and blessed. So it seems to me that there's some sort of underlying prolepsis that he seems to have identified, and then he sort of builds on that. So that it just helped to muddy the waters. So I don't think that helped explain anything, but that's sort of where I am, at least right now, for myself. I'm trying to understand that.
Well, I can explain why that idea is the one you have to rely on. If you go to an apologetics website or read an apologetics book, any example, Thomas Aquinas, for example, would be a more maybe intellectual approach to that issue. And there are certainly a whole scale of gradation on that. And you can find all of that on the internet. What they will do is point to things in nature, like, for example, the eye, the human eye, or just the human body, or the delicate relationship that exists in the biosphere between animals and plants. And how did this world come to be fine-tuned? And of course, the answer is because it was created by an intelligent being. But Epicurus, interestingly enough, has already taken that off of the table. Creation for one thing, has never happened. The atoms and the void are eternal. They have existed forever. They will exist forever. So it completely leaves the gods out of that part of the equation. And so if you can't demonstrate the existence of the gods by reference to their creation, because they don't have one, what are you left with? And I think that's where we end up with this idea of prolepsis. Mm-hmm. Essentially, the argument is all people in all countries, no matter where you go in the world, everyone has an idea of the gods. And so this must point to their real existence.
Yeah, and then the other thing I think that's really important too, as far as the nature of the gods, is that we cannot see them with their eyes. We can only perceive them with our minds. It's the whole idea of that section in the letter to Menoikeus, that they are manifest to our minds.
Okay, Don, there you've touched on where I was going to go next. One thing I've gathered from reading DeWitt over the years here, and when you compare his discussion here with other articles people have written about the nature of the Epicurean gods, you've got these competing views of where your evidence comes from. And DeWitt is starting off this section by talking about that the texts divide down into those maybe primarily in Lucretius, which do seem to imply that at least in earlier stages of human life, people were either seeing or believing that they saw gods in dreams or in certain experiences. That there is an argument that the Epicurean view of gods is based on some form of perceiving images. There's the discussion in Velleius about the images that are transmitted or received. The problem is that the text seems to say that the images flow from humans to the gods, but there is that reference in which images seem to be involved. And then there are discussions such as what Velleius is saying here when he's talking about prolepsis that do not appear to involve images. Maybe that's the best way to break it down. Is knowledge of the gods based on images, or is it based on some kind of intellectual or mental faculty that is separate from images? And I think you find people on both sides of that argument. Those who focus on images as the source of knowledge are in what DeWitt is calling this empiricist camp. And then what DeWitt does is, in this case, he favors Velleius. DeWitt tends to de-emphasize what Lucretius says and emphasize what Velleius is reporting here, and perhaps what Epicurus is saying in the letter to Menorchius. But it seems like you come down on this question to some extent based on whether you're focusing on images as the source of your knowledge or whether you're basing your position on prolepsis. And of course, then you have to sort out, does prolepsis involve images? Don, do you recall what Dr. Glidden was saying? Does he base prolepsis on images or no?
My recollection for Dr. Glidden's idea of the prolepsis is that it is a pattern recognition of the data that comes just pouring into our senses, that it's what allows us to make sense of all of that, for lack of a better way of putting it, noise that we get through our senses. Our senses are just picking up the raw data that comes in. Our faculty of the prolepsis is what allows us to say, oh, this particular noise is forming a pattern. I can recognize that pattern somewhere else. And so I'm going to assign meaning to this particular pattern of sensory input that I'm getting. And so the whole idea of extrapolating that to the gods has always been somewhat problematic for me, just to try and figure out. And you mentioned that the images flowing from or flowing to the gods. I mean, entire papers have been written on that one preposition. So there's certainly not a consensus of opinion there. A lot of people find it difficult and want to just disregard it, whereas others imbue it with, significance that it may have, over and above what it actually means. So the fact that you can have one preposition have such a impact on your understanding of a concept is just mind-boggling to me.
Shows how reliant we are on all too few texts. If we had more, presumably this would be more clear. Well, as we go through this, DeWitt's position, since we're reading his book and talking about his presentation, I think it's summarized at the bottom of 250. DeWitt says, quote, according to these evidences, the sources of knowledge about the gods are multiple. The prolepsis apprises men of the blissfulness and incorruptibility of the gods. The feelings, that is, fears and worries, serve to inform the individual of the true nature of the divine through the distress that follows from false opinions. Reason, by deductive inferences from the 12 elementary principles, informs men of the existence of the gods, of their corporeal nature, their number, their gradation in kind, and their abode. By the method of analogy, that is, progression from similars to similars, reason also produces confirmatory evidence concerning their form, by a chain argument concerning their nature, and by a disjunctive syllogism concerning the kind of life they lead. Probably all that boils down to DeWitt's taking the position that since we have three legs of the canon, the senses, anticipations, and feelings, he's thinking that all three legs of the canon have an input into our conclusions about the nature of the gods. I don't know whether anybody has an agreement or disagreement with that they'd like to say.
Yeah, it's all three legs of the canon plus the secondary or even tertiary faculties that we build up from them. So reason, for example, is not canonic, but one of the sources of information about the gods is reasoning based on canonic information.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
One thing also to say about DeWitt is that he holds the opinion, which is not universal among scholars, that the lost seventh book of Lucretius, that no one is even sure exists, was on the nature of the gods. And so he may limit the influence of Lucretius in forming his opinion on the basis that he doesn't have what Lucretius actually wrote. And I'm just making that up. I don't know what he's actually thinking, but
he's like, DeWitt seems to sometimes say, if we just had this is what it would have said. And you can't take one position and extrapolate it to the other because it doesn't exist, and you can make it say whatever you want it to.
That reminds me of, I think, something that's sort of a theme of DeWitt that we might not talk about if we don't pick it out. the issue that DeWitt seems convinced that the nature of the gods was an advanced topic that was not something that was necessarily the first thing that Epicurus would have discussed with his students.
I don't get that at all, because I mean, again, it's the first principle doctrine. It's in the letter to Menoikeus. He talks about, that you have to have a right understanding of the gods all the time. Why would he say that you have to have a right understanding of the gods all the time as the first thing that he said, and then say, but we'll talk about that later?
I'll tell you when you're older.
Yeah, I'll tell you when you're older. Yeah, exactly.
Maybe what I should have said, the details of the true natures of the gods in terms of whether they speak Greek and so forth. It seems like a lot of these things about whether the gods speak Greek and where they live and so forth, we don't really know anything about other than what is contained in the Velleia section of Cicero.
And that's why I always take that with a grain of salt. I mean, we know that Cicero is not necessarily always a reliable narrator, that he wants to make, things fit his own argument. So, I mean, I'm always a little bit skeptical of that, because one of the things that I always come out to, if the gods are supposed to live, in some corporeal form, between worlds, by definition, that means that they don't actually live on or in a world system that's anything like ours. I mean, it's if they're living between the cosmos. The cosmos is that world system with a planet and the stars around it, and then again its nice little shell, and then you got another one over here that's in its own nice little shell, and it's all self-contained sort of thing. If they're living between those, by definition, they're not actually living on any sort of planet, world, or whatever, however you want to say it, because the whole idea is that you have like these little pockets of order that are sort of nestled in this greater universe, and I just can't wrap my brain around how they would even exist if they were living between worlds. There's no world for them to live on.
Now here at the bottom of 251, I can quote something from DeWitt that agrees with Don in criticizing DeWitt. DeWitt takes the other tack and says it's equally unmistakable, on the contrary, that the essay of Epicurus entitled On Piety was prescribed reading for students of limited advancement. This is exactly what we would expect. The prime necessity for peace of mind and freedom from fear was not a knowledge of the gods, of their number, form, and abode, but the proper attitude or diathesis towards the gods. Hence, we find that in the very first of the authorized doctrines, the disciple is assured that the gods are incapable of wrath and hence need not be feared. The prime importance of the attitude is also stressed in the letter to Nicias, which warns the disciple against attributing anything to the gods that is alien to their incorruptibility or incompatible with their happiness. So, I mean, there's definitely a hugely important topic. Principal doctrine number 1, top of the letter to Nicias and so forth. It's just a question, I guess, of how far you get into the topic.
Right.
With the observation that here we don't know from Lucretius that he's had 6 long books of poetry to Memmius, and it talked a little bit about the gods being incorruptible and so forth, but not gone into a tremendous amount of detail about them.
Yeah, exactly. It seems almost like, maybe to be as gracious as to DeWitt as I can be, that there you had to. I mean, according to Epicurus, you had to have a proper, as DeWitt says, a proper attitude towards the gods. You had to wrap your brain around the fact that they were not the creators of the universe. They did not bestow blessings. They did not bestow curses. They were examples, basically, of a completely blissful, incorruptible sort of existence that was out there somewhere, maybe in the universe, or it was a projection of our own sort of aspirations as to what kind of life the ideal Epicurean life would be, and that sort of thing. So that's where it gets into, and I know we don't want to get into the weeds of the whole idealist and realist positions that are out there, but that's the kind of thing where if you have a basic understanding, Epicurus is like, this is the most important thing you need to understand, that the gods are not something to be feared. So you can get on with your life with at least, checking that box off that you don't have to worry about.
And that's the next section that DeWitt goes into on page 252, entitled, quote, the proper attitude or diathesis. So let's talk for a while about the proper attitude. DeWitt attributes to Diogenes of Ornoander a, quote, happiness is mainly a matter of attitude of which we are the arbiters, which is what we're discussing here about how the attitude is what is largely being discussed in the opening of the authorized doctrines and letter to Nicias and so forth. So let's talk about the proper attitude towards the gods for a classical Epicurean.
Well, I have an interesting thing here. I was digging around and I had sort of rediscovered. I had found it at one point, but I rediscovered there's a papyrus from Oxyrhynchus. It's number 215, which is sometimes attributed to Epicurus, but it's definitely from an Epicurean hand that was found. And I find the one paragraph from it kind of interesting whenever you're bringing this topic up. And if you'll indulge me, I'll just read this part here. So this is Oxyrhynchus Papyrus number 215. So part of it says, quote, "Nor indeed when this further statement is made by the ordinary man, quote, I fear all the gods and worship them, and to them I wish to make every sacrifice and offering," unquote. It may perhaps imply more taste on his part than the average. Nevertheless, by this formula, he has not yet reached the trustworthy principle of religion. But do you, sir, consider that the most blessed state lies in the formation of a just conception concerning the best thing that we can possibly imagine to exist, and reverence and worship this idea, unquote. So that's from the Papyrus 215. So they're talking about the fact that, if you say, you're going to worship the gods and make every sacrifice and every offering, it's just going to be a source of anxiety for you, but you have to have a just conception concerning the best thing that we can possibly imagine to exist. So that's what the gods are. They're that sort of the best thing that you can possibly exist. And then you reference and worship this idea.
And when you say that comes from Oxyrhynchus, what does that mean?
Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 215. It was Oxyrhynchus was I believe a town in Egypt where they found a cache of papyri back in the early 1900s. Joshua may even know better than I. But Oxyrhynchus was the name of the town, and they found a cache of those papyri, and they've been slowly being translated over the years. And this happens to be from a collection of those papyri that were undiscovered. And I can I'll put a link in the show notes to this specific book on archive.org.
And so that is emphasizing that the most important thing is your attitude.
Exactly. Your attitude towards the gods. And I think that really is the import of Principal Doctrine 1 and the first line of the Tetrapharmakos and the letter to Menoikeus and all of those things. It's that correct attitude towards the gods, because it was such a part of the culture that you had to fear the gods and you had to make sure you made the right sacrifices to them, and they were capricious, and you could do something you didn't even know that angered the gods, and they were still going to be angered, but you still had to try and propitiate them with sacrifices and offerings and correct attitudes towards them and all this kind of thing. And Epicurus is saying, no, the proper attitude towards the gods is just to reverence that state of blissful imperturbability that's out there that we can have. And that goes back to that whole, are we projecting that aspiration onto the gods, the images to the gods, or are the gods actually out there somewhere in that actual state and sending images to our minds, and we're apprehending them that way. So it's that whole preposition issue again.
Okay, let's put aside for just a second the issue of how we know about the gods and really what we think they're doing moment to moment, speaking Greek versus speaking American English or whatever, and go around the table and summarize what we think Epicurus is telling us to have as our main attitude about the gods.
I can answer, and it's, the title of this chapter is called The True Piety. And one of the more challenging claims that Epicurus makes to his contemporaries, and particularly to his detractors, is that because one of the things that Socrates was executed for was corrupting the Athenian youth and so forth. And so Epicurus, I think, is probably on guard against this kind of attack. And what he says, in effect, is that, actually what he says literally is that it is not, I don't have it in front of me, but he says that disbelieving in the gods of the multitude is not impious. It is impious to believe about the gods what the multitude believe. In other words, if you believe that the gods are as jealous and petty and vindictive and miserable as the common person in Greece seems to believe that they are, that's the true impiety. That's what makes it, you're really making the gods out to be something that they're not. And of course, the real victim is you, by portraying the gods as being these evil, vindictive figures. You're creating a very difficult life for yourself by constantly having to propitiate them.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, Joshua. I think that's well put. One of the things that I find interesting is that the charge of atheism was leveled on Epicurus right from ancient times. I mean, and the early Christian authors, they used him as an example of the father of atheism and all this sort of thing. And at least it seems to me that if you read Philodemus's On Piety, that it talks a lot about that Epicurus encouraged his students and himself to take part in the public festivals, and all those festivals were related to praising the gods and making sure they looked kindly on the city and this sort of thing. My take has always been that Epicurus seems to have, taken part in the festivals and that sort of thing, but he took part in them with a different attitude than everybody else, that he could sort of reverence the idea of the gods, and he could sort of put his own spin internally as to what he was doing and still take part in the dramatic performances and the processions and the dancing and whatever else was going on in those particular festivals. But he certainly seems to have wanted to get across the point where, I believe in the gods, but I believe in the gods the right way, is basically what he was saying.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is also, of course, a way to avoid scrutiny, isn't it? To,
right.
Go to the public festivals, partake in all of the ceremony, partake in all of the ritual, because to refuse that, decline that, would be in effect to decline to participate in the idea that the city-state has a protected status, that it is granted by its patron god. And as in every place that I can find in the ancient world, the answer when things go wrong is to find the people who are the problem and push all your evil onto them and push them out into the desert.
Who's not worshiping the gods right? Who's the problem here?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I do think that, I think that some people have put forward the idea that Epicurus was basically just faking it, that he was like just doing it for his own self-preservation and for looks and for show and that sort of thing. And I think that's there may be sort of a hint of that, but it seems to me at least that he did see himself as being truly pious to the gods, it seems to me, from the wording that he uses and the terms that are used and that sort of thing. So it really seems like, that, and I fully agree that he was fully aware of the idea of Socrates being put to death for impiety and corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods and that sort of thing. And so I think that on the surface, it probably looked to anybody else like, oh yeah, that Epicurus guy. Yeah, I saw him down at the festival the other day, and he was making sacrifices and he was, doing this kind of thing. And so everybody's like, oh, well, maybe he's not as big of a problem as we thought he was. But I think there's sort of, I still take it that he had some sort of internal rationalization or understanding that he truly believed that he was being as he was the most pious person probably at the festival, and everybody else had a wrong understanding.
He really did, in other words, think that they existed.
Right. In whatever way they existed, that they there was, and it wasn't the fact that they, and I think it would be important to say too that he knew that if the gods existed, they didn't really care what he did. They had no concern whatsoever. The gods were not even aware of Epicurus's existence, because they do not concern themselves with the petty goings of mortals and that sort of thing. They're just, it's not even a concern, but it provided a benefit to him to reverence that idea that there was some sort of blissful, imperturbable, existence that was there, and that's what he was sort of working towards. So maybe that's in a sense that whenever if you project images to the gods, that's the kind of thing that he's talking about. Even if they exist themselves, they don't care what you do. They don't even know your existence, but it benefits you to sort of be, I don't know, having that sense of awe or whatever to that particular state. And that's maybe what he got out of participating in the festivals and sacrificing and all that sort of thing.
There's a lot in this subsection. Well, before we continue on, I want to agree with the part of what John was saying a minute ago, that in terms of Epicurus thinking himself to be maybe the most pious one at the festival, I really do see that myself in the way these things are expressed. It seems like they consistently took the position that not only are your ideas about God's creating the universe ridiculous for physics reasons, they really did seem to buy into the conclusion that it's not I who am unpious and saying blasphemous things. You're the real blasphemer. People make comments about Epicurus's portrayal on his busts and so forth. And, he's portrayed in many cases very seriously with a very serious look in his eye. And I can see him taking the same serious position on this, almost like a fundamentalist preacher in reverse, that I've got the right position about the way the gods really are, and you are running them down and actually being unpious in taking the position that they're nothing more than rabble-rousing children in the myths that you've come up with. So,
and that's that's basically the position he seems to take in the letter to Benoicius. I mean, it's like, the ideas of the hoi polloi are not, the true understanding of the gods.
I think that's a position that's hard for people today to kind of get their minds around at all. We're very familiar with the idea of ridiculing religion on the grounds that the gods don't exist, but we're not very familiar with ridiculing religion on the grounds that you're not religious enough or you're not consistent enough in your religion to have a proper perspective on them. But that seems to be the position that Epicurus was coming from.
And I will be quite honest that this is a little into the weeds, and I don't want to get too far into this, but I still find it interesting, and I know that I believe Sedley has made a big deal out of the fact that the word God is singular in some of those sections in the letter of Benoicius, and so he talks about the God, and it seems to be an idea where each person has their own either conception or their own God that they're worried about. So that's another interesting little sidetrack that is a way that it can go too. That if there is that idea where we are sort of projecting our ideas of blissfulness and imperturbability, that each person has their own sort of idea of blissfulness and imperturbability. And it is interesting that, we have of course, the whole chapter of DeWitt to talk about things like that. But it is a sobering thought to think that entire doctoral theses and entire academic works, of hundreds of pages have been written on this very topic. So this is not one of those, one and done sort of things. This is still a topic of conversation in both scholarship and the practical application of the philosophy.
Yeah, I would like to think that the future holds much more in continuing discussion of Epicurus and his philosophy, and I do think there needs to be a lot more written on this subject, and there's a lot more profit that can be gotten from going through it and how it fits into the rest. One other comment I see that on 254, DeWitt says, quite correctly, Cicero represents his Epicurean speaker as declaring, quote, piously and reverently we worship an excelling and surpassing being, unquote. DeWitt's evaluation of it, the gods are not transcendent creatures. They merely stand at the head of a series in which human beings themselves are members.
My trepidation with lines like that is always going down the Mormon path.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not super familiar with Mormonism, but yes, I recognize that the Mormons kind of go in that direction themselves.
What's their line? Something like as God is, we will be, and as we are, God once was, or something like that.
This argument, though, that you take a quality or even a virtue, and that by indicating what the superlative of that would be, and then ascribing that to a god or as the good. This is another aspect of Greek philosophy, is taking wisdom as good, but to see wisdom as like the good. That's another way to look at this kind of, I think. Per usual, I just don't have a whole
Were you gonna endorse that line of reasoning or criticize that line of reasoning?
I'm certainly not endorsing it. No.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah. There's definite problems with hypothesizing something as if it does exist when you don't necessarily have any direct evidence that it does.
Right, and that's one of the issues I see. This could easily go down the route of Plato's ideal forms and that sort of thing, that you're idealizing the blessedness, with a capital B, or imperishability with a capital I sort of thing. So that's definitely wasn't endorsed by Epicurus, but I could easily see this as interpreted that way. I'm sorry, Joshua, I interrupted you.
No, that was very good. Give it another 5,000 years, and there would have been a splinter cell of Epicureans who rediscovered everything in Plato.
Yep. Yeah.
Just on the basis.
Well, it's kind of like using the tools of the enemy against them in a sense. And if Plato may come up with the idea that it leads to divine providence, but Epicurus maybe is using his same tools and saying, hey, a perfect being, even under your own logical formulas, is not going to do the things that you say he would do. So there's a lot more to explore there, no doubt.
And that's one thing with the whole festivals idea too, that that in Epicurus's time, that was how you worship the gods. So if he was looking for a way to be pious, for a way of celebrating the gods as he understood them correctly. Thank you very much. That was the ritual and the way to express that in a physical way, that's what you did. So I think that's another reason I could see him, taking part in the festivals and that kind of thing. That was how you worship the gods.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go on to the subsection entitled Existence of the Gods. DeWitt starts out saying that those who are bound to make an empiricist of Epicurus have been compelled to represent him as finding evidence for the existence of gods in vision. This is an error and a curious one. It was Eudoxus and Plato who appealed to vision as evidence of the existence of God. So far that God's vision is concerned, Epicurus denied that the gods were visible to the physical eye, although he did think them visible to the mind when operating as a supersensory organ of vision. And he says the value attached to this evidence, however, was strictly limited. This is, again, DeWitt coming down on the side of prolepsis as the main basis for knowledge of the gods versus vision or images.
Yeah, that whole idea of the vision, whether the mind or the eye or whatever, is, I believe, taken directly from the letter to Menoikeus. And the words that's used there is that the gods are enarges. Enarges is the Greek word. And it's interesting because it has actually two different meanings. One is visible, palpable, in bodily shape, that sort of thing. But in the dictionary, it also says that it's properly of the gods appearing in their own form. So that's the word that Homer used when people were seeing the gods in the Iliad and the Odyssey, that they were enarges. They were visible to the eye. But the interesting thing is that the other connotation of that word is that it's manifest to the mind's eye, that you can see it in your imagination, basically. So my contention is that, Epicurus could not have meant the first meaning, because he was specifically quoted somewhere as saying that they lived in the intermundia, in the metacosmos, between the worlds and stuff. So they weren't actually, you could never actually see them, but you could clearly discern them in your mind. There was some way that you could discern the gods' existence in your mind. So that's where it seems that DeWitt is getting that dichotomy there.
The discernment of them is, I think, the focus of page 256 of the book, where this material that I'm looking at now is closely related, I think, what Dr. Glidden was talking to us about. Even though DeWitt generally embraces Cicero's description of the knowledge of the gods, what DeWitt seems to be saying is that he doesn't think that we should interpret Velleius as saying that there's something written in our brains that there is a God. DeWitt compares this to more of a genetic process in which there is a capacity, it looks like, to, when stimulated, develop in a particular direction, and that we should not consider this to be a tablet on which something is written, because that would not be an Epicurean idea, but it's just something that develops over time. Here's DeWitt's example. The idea of God is thought of as emerging in the mind, just as the network of veins emerges in the embryo, prefiguring and anticipating the development of the whole organism.
And if I remember correctly, please correct me if I'm misremembering this, but the whole idea of the prolepsis of the gods, the only prolepsis is that there is a blissful and indestructible being or existence or that sort of. So that's the only thing that the prolepsis gives us. Everything else is sort of built on top of that then. So whether they speak Greek or whether they're in human form, or what they eat, what they drink, what their bodies are made of, that would all be on top of that prolepsis. So that prolepsis to me seems to be the most important understanding that you can have, that there is, going back to Principal Doctrine 1, it seems that the uses of the word right there of blissful and imperishable beings don't bother anybody, basically, is what the Principal Doctrine 1 says. So I think that that's the kernel of the correct understanding. If you have a conception of that is the true piety that he's talking about, that you have to realize that a blissful and imperishable being is not going to have anything to do with the creation of the world. It's not going to have anything to do with bestowing blessings. It's not going to have anything to do. That kernel of understanding there is the most important point that you can make, because that's the one that keeps getting made in the Principal Doctrines and the letter of Menoikeus and elsewhere. That's what you need to understand, it seems to me. Now, how that gets translated into a practical application and how we should understand it now in the modern world and all that sort of thing, those are other topics for discussion as well. But I think that as far as the kernel of the philosophy itself, that's where the true piety comes in, that the idea that a blissful and imperishable being is not going to have anything to do with you, basically, is the understanding that you need to wrap your brain around to get rid of that anxiety.
One thing I've always found problematic is in many ways is when I compare the way Lucretius talks about the gods to the way he talks about centaurs. It would almost seem like his discussion of centaurs, that this is just two different images that got jumbled together, and centaurs aren't real, but horses are real, and humans are real, and when they get jumbled together, you get a centaur. And I've always been sitting there thinking to myself, well, couldn't that same line of argument in the hands of the right person be made to basically uproot this whole idea of the gods if they also come from visions or from images? Well, on 257, DeWitt has this to say. He says, in respect of the evidence afforded by dreams, it is timely to issue a general and a specific warning. The general warning is against the assumption that the doctrines of Epicurus are easy to understand. The specific warning is against assigning more than a minimum value to the evidence of dreams. The vision of gods seen in a dream is no more evidence for the existence of gods than a vision of centaurs is evidence for the existence of centaurs.
So where does that leave us? That's
okay. Joshua's going to keep reading, I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Only two functions are assigned to dreams in the extant authorities. One function, as gleaned from Sextus Empiricus, is to act as a stimulus to the innate prolepsis of Godhead, which up to a point is merely potential, and thus render it actual. The other function is to furnish a hint and no more of the form of the gods, as Cicero informs us. And he goes on to say, more will be said of this under the heading that next follows.
Yeah, Joshua, it seems like trying to stand in DeWitt's shoes. His interpretation to me seems to be he is focusing on prolepsis as a genetic or some kind of a native capacity within the mind. And he believes that you have to add on to the top of that a stimulus that capacity may not necessarily develop, but that it has to be affected by a stimulus from the outside. So DeWitt at least seems to me to be saying that the final picture is a result of this innate capacity, which is not anything more than a sort of an encoding of DNA to think, but that it has been stimulated to do so by these images that may or may not come through dreams and so forth. So DeWitt sees two components to the final picture. I don't think DeWitt himself either is saying that a lot of the details are reliable. He's warning against thinking that these extended speculations about speaking Greek and so forth are particularly reliable or even important to Epicurus.
I would concur with that, yeah. Like I said, that basic understanding seems to be the most important part, the piety part of that.
Yeah, the basic understanding that prolepsis is the root of it. And then again, as Lucretius discusses in Book 4 about these images, it does seem that there's more to be discovered as well about what Epicurus was saying that images really do in terms of stimulating us to thought or to action. But there's some combination of both of them that has to be considered. It seems to me, when I read a lot of commentaries, I see an awful lot of emphasis on going to Lucretius and looking at discussions of dreams. And I think DeWitt may be a good counterbalance to that by saying that you got to interpret also what Velleius is saying about prolepsis. So this is probably the place to start winding up for the day. I just looked at the clock and see we're going about the normal length so far today.
And I think we talked about a half an hour or two beforehand. So.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin to conclude today's episode. We've probably already bitten off a lot more that is difficult to chew. And so let's discuss our thoughts on what's been said so far. Calasini, any thoughts today?
As I've listened to this, it seems like there's a lot there that I would find hard to make practical for now. But that's just me.
DeWitt would say to you, Calasini, what Joshua has already quoted, the general warning is against the assumption that the doctrines of Epicurus are easy to understand. Joshua?
Yeah, I, as usual, when we talk about the gods, find myself at a total loss here. And that's no less true today. What I do find slightly interesting and maybe even a little bit compelling is in Lucretius when he says that we should think of the earth as our mother in some ways. That's the part that really draws me. And we see it in that passage in Romeo and Juliet. It's the soliloquy of Friar Lawrence, right when Romeo is first coming into the cell to meet him. And he says, earth, that's nature's mother, is her tomb. What is her burying grave? that is her womb, and from her womb children of diverse kinds, we sucking on her natural bosom find. So there's a poetic aspect of it that I find interesting. Also, the idea that, of course, this is our home. This is where we live, where most of us are never, ever, ever in our lives going to leave this world except in death. So I find that compelling. Most of the rest of this, I just have a lot of issues with, but that's where I'm at.
Don.
Well, as far as our listeners go, hopefully they've come to understand that this is a complicated subject, even for us who have been doing this for a while. So if anybody is confused, I think it helps to know that you're not alone. I always find it interesting, like I said, that Epicurus really seems to have emphasized a proper understanding of the gods first and foremost in his philosophy, literally first and foremost in his philosophy. I do think that we have to take into account the cultural ramifications of that in his time as opposed to our time. That said, I think there are also people who still believe in capital G God or lowercase gods, that this kind of understanding where through the physics and everything else that the gods really don't care about you, or it's not even that they don't care, they're not even aware of your existence, so don't worry about them, could be helpful if they work out the understanding from basic physics components to where this idea comes from. So I think that there is some practical application there somewhere, but it truly is a complicated subject. And it's another one of those things where it always comes to my mind that we are so lacking in the number of texts that we have to us from Epicurus himself. So the fact that we don't have all of his ideas is just another one of those frustrations that we have to deal with what we have to deal with.
One thing I could say to that, Don, is maybe more cheering than what I said last, is I think of that episode in Lucian and Alexander the Oracle Monger, where he takes Epicurus's books and burns them in the public market. I think that if your books are being burned by a false prophet in Asia Minor, you're doing something right. I don't understand.
Right.
I don't understand fully what that thing is, but I feel like there's something there that's worth pursuing. And maybe I haven't been as attentive to that today as I could have been, but I do find that compelling.
That's a very good point. I like that. That's a good way to close.
Okay, I'll close by saying that this is a pretty long chapter and there's a lot of detail in it and a lot of things that we're going to be discussing. The cliche about not being able to see the forest for the trees. We're going to be looking at a lot of trees over the next couple of weeks in this section of the True Piety. But the forest of where all this fits together, I think, is pretty clear. Epicurus was engaged in philosophy to bring healing, bring a more successful way of living for people who are misled by all sorts of errors in philosophy and in religion. And he's providing a worldview, is a good word for it, that most people, it seems like in life, and maybe everybody in life needs, whether they admit it or not, and a general understanding of where divinity fits into this worldview ends up being important to most people, at least at certain points in their lives and maybe all the way through their lives. And Epicurus's summary, even though we don't have all the details of it, points to a pretty clear way in which he was looking at the subject, getting rid of the problems that common understandings of religion had planted in human life, pointing a way out of it that is uniquely different. And some of us are going to find the details to be of interest and helpful, and some of us are not. But I do think we want to help nail the lid on the coffins of the idea that Epicurus was being cynical or not being truthful in the way he was presenting all this. There seems to be a large component here that Epicurus thought it's helpful morally, spiritually, however you want to look at it, to have this conception of what the blessed life would be like. We'll have many more things to say about this. In the meantime, please drop by the forum and give us your comments and questions. We'll be back in a week for more. See you then. Bye.